Three things that might be helpful. You don't want to live here, but someday you might. If you ever find yourself living in a place that's very different than where you are from, I have some advice for you. And call it three things that might be helpful. The first is to interact empathetically. I mean that when I say I'm no better or worse than anyone I meet on the street here. You have to believe that. Maybe more than you believe anything. People have a great bullshit meter, and the people here are people too. You cannot judge. You can dislike something you see, and you can push back on illegal activity, but you cannot judge until you fully understand what it must be like to grow up and interact with the world here. Unfortunately, you will never fully understand. I don't know how long it would take to grasp what it means to be a marginalized person living in abject poverty your whole life, but I know it takes longer than 18 years. Today, I do not know what it is like, but tomorrow I want to understand a little more. The easiest way to understand more is to listen, but listening is different than hearing. If you're married or you have a longtime partner, you've experienced the difference. Meg and I have had a lot of arguments since we've been married, like all couples do. A classic argument from years ago would have been me choosing to work on a house project instead of doing something together during the day on a Saturday. Before I knew how long a remodel takes, her and I would agree that we want to renovate some part of the house, like the kitchen. In my head, I knew it would never get done unless I worked on it, and it always takes longer than I expect. Of all the things I do, working on a house is the easiest for me to agree to in advance. I like the work, and I get a lot of satisfaction in completing a project, even a small part of a larger project. After teaching for a while, I figured out that the small win of finishing the water lines for the kitchen or closing up the walls for the first time is super satisfying. Because of that, I don't mind committing on a Tuesday to work on a Saturday because I'll predictably feel good about the time spent. A kitchen remodel is a big job. Like most big jobs in the process of restoring a home, it takes time and the work doesn't do itself. When Meg would ask what I wanted to do on a Saturday, my response was I wanted to work on the house. She heard I would rather work on the house than spend time with you. What I was saying was, in order to give you this thing that you want, a new kitchen, I have to spend the time working on it. When she would say you don't want to spend time with me, I would hear you agreed that we should complete this home remodel project. I'm doing most of the work on it. And now you're changing your mind, which is fine, but the kitchen is torn apart and someone has to put it back together. We heard the words coming out of the other person's mouth, but had a hard time hearing what each other was saying. That happens all the time. People say things. I'm going to beat his ass. I've heard someone say that they're going to beat someone's ass 1,000 times in my life. Very rarely does anyone beat anyone else's ass. If you take what you hear at face value, you will struggle to exist within a place of non-judgment. Almost always that statement is communicating someone is frustrated, and almost never it is communicating someone's intentions to beat someone else's ass. Judgment is the opposite of empathy, or maybe it's empathy's kryptonite. You almost have to be non-judgmental to a fault. There's a guy who asks me for work or $2 or a cigarette at least 2 times a month. I've told him 30 times in my life that I don't smoke. He buys blunt wraps for kids and sells them weed. I don't like that he does those things, but I don't know what it's like to be him. I'll never actually know. He wanders around the neighborhood and sells random things. I have some thoughts about where he gets the random things he sells. They look like they once belonged to someone else. I don't encourage what I assume he is doing, stealing things and then selling them to random people on the street, but I make a strong attempt not to judge because I don't know what it's like to be him. Asking for $2 and selling random things to someone walking by is not something I have ever wanted or needed to do. I don't know what that would be like. I don't know what it is like to have that scenario as a plausible option, or let alone to have that be my best option. I hope I never know what it's like. Even though I don't want to be him, I would like something better for him. If you do end up finding yourself living in a place like my neighborhood, you are going to be tempted to take. Don't do that. A few weeks after moving into our house, a friend asked if we were worried about gentrification. When you have an experience that is unique or different, I don't know, you do a podcast or you write a book about it. We already do a podcast, so a book seemed like the next right thing to do. But the desire to write a book about living in the inner city has been elevated by the small things that point to gentrification coming. Gentrification is the result of people with access taking from those who do not. Right before we bought our house, the homeowner had it repainted, which is great, except they didn't scrape any of the old paint off, so the entire building was dotted with uneven areas where more or less paint existed. I made an attempt at restoring it by sanding down a big section of one of the walls, but gave up when I did the mental math on how long it would take to do the whole house. The following summer, my dad and my sister and I resided 3 of the 4 sides and finished the 4th side the following summer. That was about 10 years ago. It wasn't until 2023, 9 years later, that I saw another house resided in our neighborhood. I've still never seen someone build a garage here, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's coming soon. There's this paint color that people are using nowadays. It's a dark, maybe navy blue. I call it gentrification blue. You can spray a house with aluminum siding, gentrification blue, and turn it immediately from outdated to sharp. I've been seeing a lot of gentrification blue houses popping up. This was the right time to write all of this because gentrification is coming. When the friend asked us about gentrification in 2006, I laughed. I laughed because at the time I think my neighbors would have taken anything in terms of growth or advancement to the area. After a couple of decades of decline and decay, the prospects of their neighborhood turning into anything other than it was, I felt, was appealing. Honestly, when she asked me about gentrification, I didn't totally know what she was talking about. I had to Google gentrification to get a definition of the word. When I sat there in front of the computer and read what it meant, it seemed so ridiculous of a concept that I honestly never thought it could happen here. Almost 20 years later, I can see it as a realistic possibility, but even with the signs that it might be possible, I do not believe it to be inevitable. At the core of gentrification is the idea that people like me use their access to displace someone with lesser means from a place that was once undesirable that has now become desirable. The people with means take over a place where they would have avoided in the past. I didn't always leave from my house when I would go on my daily run. I used to get in the car and drive to the lakefront to run. Our neighborhood is less than 4 miles from Lake Michigan. I had a 3, 4, and 5 mile loop. It's a beautiful run through the streets with historic homes on either side and a long stretch along the lake. It's where I started walking my daughter after work, which turned into jogs and eventually runs. About 5 years ago, I stopped doing that and began starting my runs from my front door. For years now, I run south toward downtown with my turnaround point looking out onto the Fiserv Forum, where the Milwaukee Bucks play. We live 2 miles from the stadium, which opened in 2018. Like any new development, the area surrounding the space becomes more desirable. When you run the same route most days, you notice little things like a Honda Goldwing motorcycle that hasn't moved, ever. A guy named Ronnie owns that motorcycle, and his wife won't let him ride it anymore because of the reckless drivers in the city. Ronnie lives in a low-income housing development, which he describes as a stone's throw from the stadium. I can throw a rock at the Fiserv Forum, but I can't afford a fucking ticket to get in. He told me this after explaining how someone did or was trying to buy up the hundreds of rental units in the complex he lived in for decades. His resignation told me that it was only a matter of time before he was displaced as his rent increased and priced him out of his apartment. A place where people avoided was becoming a place where people that looked like me wanted to live. Gentrification occurs when people take. The guy who sends me postcards with my name spelled wrong is trying to take one of my houses. He would benefit from the transaction, not me. I think there is a window of time that is still open when a person would have to deal with the challenging aspects of living in the inner city long enough to be cleared morally from any positive effects on their net worth living in a once impoverished and now gentrified space would have. What shouldn't limit our actions is fear. Fear tells us to do nothing. Rather, what we should do is cultivate a deep understanding that if you were to move into a neighborhood that is evolving, anyone living there before you has dealt with everything that comes from living in an area of concentrated poverty. The general belief is that there are only two options for my neighborhood. It stays the same, or it's gentrified. But what if there was a third option? The third option is rooted in non-judgment and requires people to move cautiously when deciding to acquire property within the neighborhood. There's nothing wrong with the neighborhood improving, but it should get better for the benefit of the people already living there, not just the individual buying the property. If you do find yourself living here, I would tell you not to judge, to give rather than take, and expect your time here to be abundantly and overwhelmingly rewarding. I was talking with a woman at a school. We were doing an activity where we looked at demographic data for the city the school is located in. Part of that work was to watch short clips from news articles about the town. One of those clips was from a mural that wasn't actually in that town. Instead, it was on the south side of Milwaukee where she happened to do a homeless outreach. I'm interested in anyone that does work paid or voluntarily for people of a lower economic status than their own. It's hard to find a group of people with a lower economic status than the homeless. She told me how rewarding that work was and that she loved it. She loved it enough that she would spend more than half of her Saturday mornings a year working with the homeless. One of the reasons Christianity was so appealing to me as a young person was the insistence on helping the poor. You never actually helped the poor for them, you helped the poor for you. Doing good in the world is good for those you do the good for, but it's equally as good for you. You can never expect that work to be easy, but you should leave open the possibility that the work will be satisfying. It actually reminds me of running. By now, almost 8 years into running 3 miles every day, I enjoy the actual time spent running, but I don't get up early every day to do this activity that I enjoy. There are a lot of other things I could do that I enjoy just as much or more than running down A Street, like, sleeping. I do it because of the satisfaction I get. The satisfaction or the reward is worth more than the discomfort. The reward is worth more than the energy expended to accomplish the task. Running is that way for me, so I do it every day. Living here, attempting to be a positive, productive member of the community in whatever form that takes is the same way. I don't mind when crackheads steal my flowers because in the same week, I'll have 4 or 5 opportunities to help someone, or I'll be at the garden with 100 kids cleaning up the neighborhood. If it is that way for me, I wouldn't expect it to be any different for you. The basic principles of non-judgment and giving rather than taking are, more often than not, will net you a rewarding life. When I lay down at night, I'm content. I'm content because I look back on the day and I think about the contributions I have made to making the world a little more like I think it should be. And I've done so in a place that could really benefit from those contributions. Your proximity to need only makes the reward greater. The closer you can get to the need, the more you understand it. And the more you do something to meet the need, the more satisfying it is to be the change you want to see.